Okay.
Anderson was a practical farmer. His first work, in which the nature of rent is discussed in passing, appeared in 1777, at a time when, for a large section of the public, Sir James Stewart was still the leading economist, and while everyone's attention was focused on The Wealth of Nations, which had appeared a year earlier. As against this, the work of the Scottish farmer, which had been occasioned by an immediate practical controversy, and which did not ex professo deal with rent, but only incidentally elucidated its nature, could not attract any attention. In this work, Anderson only dealt with rent accidentally, not explicitly. This theory of his appears again in the same incidental fashion in one or two of his collected essays, which he himself published in 3 volumes under the title of Essays Relating to Agricultural and Rural Affairs, published in Edinburgh between 1775 and 1796.
Alrighty, welcome.
Similarly, in his Recreations in Agriculture, Natural History, Arts, etc., published in London between the years of 1799 and 1802.
We've been looking at theories of surplus value.
All these writings are directly intended for farmers and agriculturalists.
We're up to chapter 9.
It would have been different if Anderson had an inkling of the importance of his find,
as usual, I'm going to play the
as an inquiry into the nature of rent, or if he had had the least bit of talent in trading his own ideas, as his fellow countryman McCulloch did so successfully with other people.
Listen to
the reproductions of his theory, which appeared in 1815, were published forthwith as independent theoretical inquiries into the nature of rent.
The purpose of doing this,
the very titles of the respective works of West and Malthus show.
Not
the title
ignore,
of Malthus is an inquiry into the nature and progress of rent, and the title of
surplus
West,
value for
essay on the
a variety of
application
reasons
of capital
to perhaps gain better insights as
Furthermore,
to
Malthus used the
the
Andersonian
context
theory
and
of rent
content
to give
of
his
theories of
population
surplus
law,
value
for the
as
first
it
time,
is a kind
both
of
an
intermediate
economic
text,
and a real natural historical basis,
and considering
while the
that
nonsense
where
about
we are
geometrical
currently
and
is
arithmetical progression
making
borrowed
some
from earlier writers
commentaries
was a purely imaginary
the
hypothesis.
differences among
Mr. Malthus at once
between capital,
improved the matter. Ricardo even made
Capital
this
Volume
doctrine
1,
of rent, as
or
he
Capital
himself
in
says in
general,
his preface, one of the
Volume
most
1, 2, and
important
3,
links in the
with,
whole system of political
the
economy,
Grundrisse.
and quite
So,
apart from the practical aspect, gave it an entirely
looking
new
at theories
theoretical
of surplus
importance.
value is another
Ricardo
way in
evidently
which you
did
can
not know
combine
Anderson, since in the preface
looking
to
at
his
the
Principles of
Grundrisse
Political Economy,
and,
he treats West and
on
Malthus
particular
as the
kinds of
originators.
issues.
Judging by the
And,
original manner in which he presents the law,
not
West
simply
was possibly
surplus
as
value,
little
but all the
acquainted
things
with
that go
Anderson as
into
Tuke
it,
was with Stewart.
including
With Mr. Malthus, it is different.
exchange
a close
value
comparison
and,
of his writings
use value.
shows that
So,
he
here
knows
we go.
and uses Anderson. He was in fact plagiarist by profession. One need only compare the first edition of his work on population with the work of the Reverend Townsend, which I have quoted previously, to be convinced that he does not work him over as an independent producer, but copies him and paraphrases. Chapter 9. Notes on the history of the discovery of the so-called Ricardian law of rent. Section 1. The discovery of the law of differential rent by Anderson. Distortion of Anderson's views by his plagiarist, Malthus, in the interests of the landowners. Anderson was a practical farmer. His first work, in which the nature of rent is discussed in passing, appeared in 1777, at a time when, for a large section of the public, Sir James Stewart was still the leading economist, and while everyone's attention was focused on The Wealth of Nations, which had appeared a year earlier. As against this, the work of the Scottish farmer, which had been occasioned by an immediate practical controversy, and which did not ex professo deal with rent, but only incidentally elucidated its nature, could not attract any attention. In this work, Anderson only dealt with rent accidentally, not explicitly. This theory of his appears again in the same incidental fashion in one or two of his collected essays, which he himself published in 3 volumes under the title of Essays Relating to Agricultural and Rural Affairs, published in Edinburgh between 1775 and 1796. Similarly, in his Recreations in Agriculture, Natural History, Arts, etc., published in London between the years of 1799 and 1802. All these writings are directly intended for farmers and agriculturalists. It would have been different if Anderson had had an inkling of the importance of his find and had put it before the public separately as an inquiry into the nature of rent, or if he had had the least bit of talent in trading his own ideas, as his fellow countryman McCulloch did so successfully with other people's. The reproductions of his theory, which appeared in 1815, were published forthwith as independent theoretical inquiries into the nature of rent, as the very titles of the respective works of West and Malthus show. The title of Malthus's, An Inquiry into the Nature and Progress of Rent, and the title of West's, Essay on the Application of Capital to Land. Furthermore, Malthus used the Andersonian theory of rent to give his population law, for the first time, both an economic and a real natural historical basis, while the nonsense about geometrical and arithmetical progression borrowed from earlier writers was a purely imaginary hypothesis. Mr. Malthus at once improved the matter. Ricardo even made this doctrine of rent, as he himself says in his preface, one of the most important links in the whole system of political economy, and quite apart from the practical aspect, gave it an entirely new theoretical importance. Ricardo evidently did not know Anderson, since, in the preface to his Principles of Political Economy, he treats West and Malthus as the originators. Judging by the original manner in which he presents the law, West was possibly as little acquainted with Anderson as Tuke was with Stuart. With Mr. Malthus, it is different. A close comparison of his writings shows that he knows and uses Anderson. He was in fact plagiarist by profession. One need only compare the first edition of his work on population with the work of the Reverend Townsend, which I have quoted previously, to be convinced that he does not work him over as an independent producer, but copies him and paraphrases him like a slavish plagiarist, although he does not mention him anywhere by name and conceals his existence. The manner in which Malthus used Anderson is characteristic. Anderson had defended premiums on exports of corn and duties on corn imports, not out of any interest for the landlords, but because he believed that this type of legislation, quote, would reduce the average price of corn, end quote, and ensure an even development of the productive forces in agriculture. Malthus accepted this practical application of Anderson's because, being a staunch member of the established Church of England, he was a professional sycophant of the landed aristocracy, whose rents, sinecures, squandering, heartlessness, etc. he justified economically. Malthus defends the interest of the industrial bourgeoisie only insofar as these are identical with the interests of landed property, of the aristocracy, i.e. against the mass of the people, the proletariat. But where these interests diverge and are antagonistic to each other, he sides with the aristocracy against the bourgeoisie. Hence his defense of the unproductive worker, overconsumption, etc. Anderson, on the other hand, explained the difference between land which pays rent and that which does not, or between lands which pay varying rents, by the relatively low fertility of the land which bears no rent, or a smaller rent compared with that which bears a rent, or greater rent. But he stated expressly that these degrees of relative productivity of different types of land, i.e. also the relatively low productivity of the worst types of land compared with the better, had absolutely nothing to do with the absolute productivity of agriculture. On the contrary, he stressed not only that the absolute productivity of all types of land could be constantly improved, and must be improved with the progress in population, but he went further and asserted that the differences in productivity of various types of land can be progressively reduced. He said that the present degree of development of agriculture in England gives no indication at all of its possibilities. That is why he said that in one country the prices of corn may be high and rent low, while in another country the price of corn may be low and rent may be high. And this is in accordance with his principle, since the level and the existence of rents is in both countries determined by the difference between the fertile and the unfertile land, in neither of them by the absolute fertility, in each only by the degree of difference in fertility of the existing types of land, and not by the average fertility of these types. From this, he concluded that the absolute fertility of agriculture has nothing to do with rent. Hence later, as we shall see below, he declared himself a decided adversary of the Malthusian theory of population, and it never dawned on him that his own theory of rent was to serve as the basis of this monstrosity. Anderson reasoned that the rise in corn prices in England between 1750 and 1801, as compared with the years 1700 to 1750, was by no means due to the cultivation of progressively less fertile types of land, but to the influence of legislation on agriculture during these two periods. What then did Malthus do? Instead of his also plagiarized chimera of the geometrical and arithmetical progression, which he retained as a phrase, he made Anderson's theory the confirmation of his population theory. He retained Anderson's practical application of the theory insofar as it was in the interests of the landlords. This fact alone proves that he understood as little of the connection of this theory with the system of bourgeois economy as Anderson himself. Without going into the counter-evidence which the discoverer of the theory put forward, he turned it against the proletariat. The theoretical and practical advances which could have been made from this theory were as follows. The theoretical, for the determination of the value of the commodity, etc., and gaining an insight into the nature of land ownership. The practical, against the necessity of the private ownership of land, on the basis of bourgeois production, and more immediately against all state regulations such as corn laws, which enhanced this ownership of land. These advances from Anderson's theory, Malthus left to Ricardo. The one practical conclusion which he drew from it was a defense of the protective tariffs which the landlord demanded in 1815, a sycophantic service for the aristocracy, and a new justification for the poverty of the producers of wealth, a new apology for the exploiters of labor. In this respect, it was a sycophantic service for the industrial capitalists. Utter baseness is a distinctive trait of Malthus, a baseness which can only be indulged in by a person who sees human suffering as the punishment for sin, and who in any case needs a veil of tears on earth, but who at the same time, in view of the living he draws and aided by the dogma of predestination, finds it altogether advantageous to sweeten their sojourn in the vale of tears for the ruling classes. The baseness of this mind is also evident in his scientific work. Firstly, in his shameless and mechanical plagiarism, secondly, in the cautious, not radical, conclusions which he draws from scientific premises. Section 2. Ricardo's fundamental principle in assessing economic phenomena is the development of the productive forces. Malthus defends the most reactionary elements of the ruling classes. Virtual refutation of Malthus's theory of population by Darwin. Ricardo, rightly for his time, regards the capitalist mode of production as the most advantageous for production in general, as the most advantageous for the creation of wealth. He wants production for the sake of production, and this with good reason. To assert, as sentimental opponents of Ricardo's did, that production as such is not the object, is to forget that production for its own sake means nothing but the development of human productive forces. In other words, the development of the richness of human nature as an end in itself. To oppose the welfare of the individual to this end, as Sismondi does, is to assert that the development of the species must be arrested in order to safeguard the welfare of the individual, so that, for instance, no war may be waged in which, at all events, some individuals perish. Sismondi is only right as against the economists who conceal or deny this contradiction. Apart from the barrenness of such edifying reflections, they reveal a failure to understand the fact that although at first the development of the capacities of the human species takes place at the cost of the majority of human individuals, and even classes, in the end it breaks through this contradiction and coincides with the development of the individual. The higher development of individuality is thus only achieved by a historical process during which individuals are sacrificed for the interests of the species in the human kingdom, as in the animal and plant kingdoms, always assert themselves at the cost of the interests of individuals, because these interests of the species coincide only with the interests of certain individuals, and it is this coincidence which constitutes the strength of these privileged individuals. Thus, Ricardo's ruthlessness was not only scientifically honest, but also a scientific necessity from his point of view. But because of this, it is also quite immaterial to him whether the advance of the productive forces slays landed property or workers. If this progress devalues the capital of the industrial bourgeoisie, it is equally welcome to him. If the development of the productive power of labor halves the value of the existing fixed capital, what does it matter, says Ricardo. The productivity of human labor has doubled. Thus, here is scientific honesty. Ricardo's conception is, on the whole, in the interests of the industrial bourgeoisie, only because and insofar as their interests coincide with that of production, or the productive development of human labor. Where the bourgeoisie comes into conflict with this, he is just as ruthless towards it as he is at other times towards the proletariat and the aristocracy. But Malthus, this wretch only draws such conclusions from the given scientific premises, which he invariably steals, as will be agreeable, that is, useful, to the aristocracy against the bourgeoisie, and to both against the proletariat. He does not want production for the sake of production, but only insofar as it maintains or extends the status quo and serves the interests of the ruling classes. Already his first work, one of the most remarkable literary examples of the success of plagiarism at the cost of the original work, had the practical purpose to provide economic proof in the interests of the existing English government and the landed aristocracy that the tendency of the French Revolution and its adherents in England to perfect matters was utopian. In other words, it was a panegyric pamphlet for the existing conditions, against historical development, and furthermore, a justification of the war against revolutionary France. His writings of 1815 on protective tariffs and rent were partly means to confirm the earlier apology of the poverty of the producers, in particular, however, to defend reactionary landed property against enlightened, liberal, and progressive capital, and especially to justify an intended retrogressive step in English legislation in the interests of the aristocracy against the industrial bourgeoisie. Finally, his principles of political economy directed against Ricardo had essentially the purpose of reducing the absolute demands of industrial capital and the laws under which its productivity develops to the desirable limits favorable to the existing interests of the landed aristocracy, the established church to which Malthus belonged, government pensioners, and consumers of taxes. But when a man seeks to accommodate science to a viewpoint which is derived not from science itself, however erroneous it may be, but from outside, from alien, external interests, then I call him base. It is not a base action when Ricardo puts the proletariat on the same level as machinery or beasts of burden or commodities, because from his point of view, their being purely machinery or beasts of burden is conducive to production, or because they really are mere commodities in bourgeois production. This is stoic, objective, and scientific. Insofar as it does not involve sinning against his science, Ricardo is always a philanthropist, just as he was in practice too. The parson, Malthus, on the other hand, reduces the worker to a beast of burden for the sake of production, and even condemns him to death from starvation and to celibacy. But when these same demands of production curtail the landlord's rent, or threaten to encroach on the tithes of the established church, or in the interests of the consumers of taxes, and also when that part of the industrial bourgeoisie whose interests stand in the way of progress is being sacrificed to that part which represents the advance of production, and therefore whenever it is a question of the interests of the aristocracy against the bourgeoisie, or of the conservative and stagnant bourgeoisie against the progressive, in all these instances, Parson Malthus does not sacrifice the particular interest to production, but seeks, as far as he can, to sacrifice the demands of production to the particular interests of existing ruling classes, or sections of classes. And to this end, he falsifies his scientific conclusions. This is his scientific baseness, his sin against science, quite apart from his shameless and mechanical plagiarism. The scientific conclusions of Malthus are considerate towards the ruling classes in general, and towards the reactionary elements of the ruling classes in particular. In other words, he falsifies science for those interests. But his conclusions are ruthless insofar as they concern the subjugated classes. He is not only ruthless, he affects ruthlessness. He takes a cynical pleasure in it, and exaggerates his conclusions insofar as they are directed against the poor wretches, even beyond the point which would be scientifically justified from his point of view. The hatred of the English working classes for Malthus, the charlatan parson, as Cobbett rudely called him, Cobbett, though England's greatest political writer of this century, lacked the Leipzig professorial scholarship, and was pronounced enemy of the learned language. This hatred of Malthus was thus fully justified, and the people's instinct was correct here, in that they felt he was no man of science, but a bought advocate of their opponents, a shameless sycophant of the ruling classes. The inventor of an idea may exaggerate it in all honesty. When the plagiarist exaggerates it, he always makes a business of such an exaggeration. Because the first edition of Malthus's work, On Population, contains not a single new scientific word, it is to be regarded purely as an obtrusive Capuchin sermon, an Abraham, a Santa Clara version of the discoveries of Townsend, Stewart, Wallace, Herbert, etc. Since in fact it only wants to impress by its popular form, popular hate rightly turns against it. As compared to the wretched bourgeois economists who preach harmony, Malthus's only merit lies in his pointed emphasis on the disharmonies, which, though none of them were discovered by him, were all emphasized, amplified, and publicized by him with complacent sacerdotal cynicism. Charles Darwin, in the introduction to his On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of the Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, published in London in 1860, says the following, quote, "In the next chapter, the struggle for existence amongst all organic beings throughout the world, which inevitably follows from the high geometrical ratio of their increase, will be treated of. This is the doctrine of Malthus applied to the whole animal and vegetable kingdoms." In his splendid work, Darwin did not realize that by discovering the geometrical progression in the animal and plant kingdom, he overthrew Malthus's theory. Malthus's theory is based on the fact that he set Wallace's geometrical progression of man against the chimerical arithmetical progression of animals and plants. In Darwin's work, for instance, on the extinction of species, we also find, quite apart from his fundamental principle, the detailed refutation, based on natural history, of the Malthusian theory. But insofar as Malthus's theory rests upon Anderson's theory of rent, it was refuted by Anderson himself. Section 3. Roscher's falsification of the history of views on ground rent. Examples of Ricardo's scientific impartiality. Rent from capital investments in land, and rent from the exploitation of other elements of nature. The twofold influence of competition. Anderson's first publication, in which he develops the theory of rent as a byproduct, was a practical polemic, not on rent, but on protection. It appeared in 1777, and its very title, an inquiry into the nature of the Corn Laws, with a view to the new Corn Bill proposed for Scotland, shows firstly that it pursues a practical purpose, secondly that it is related to an imminent act of legislation, in which the interests of the manufacturers and the landlords are diametrically opposed. The law of 1773, in England to be looked up in Macculloch's catalogue, was due, so it appears, to be introduced into Scotland in 1777. Says Anderson, quote, "The law of 1773 was constructed with the avowed intention of lowering the price of corn to our manufacturers by encouraging the importation of corn from abroad for the purpose of feeding our own people at a cheaper rate." Thus, Anderson's publication was a polemic on behalf of the interests of the agriculturalists, inclusive of the landlords, against the interests of the manufacturers, and he published it avowedly as such a partisan piece of writing. The theory of rent comes in here only incidentally. In his later writings, which are to a greater or lesser degree continuously concerned with this battle of interests, he merely repeats the theory of rent once or twice in passing. He never pretends to a scientific interest in it, and it does not even become an independent subject in his presentation. Accordingly, one may judge the correctness of the following remarks of Wilhelm Roscher, who was evidently not acquainted with Anderson's writings. Quote, "Remarkable how a doctrine which in 1777 remained almost unnoticed was immediately defended and attacked with the greatest interest in 1815 and in the following years, because it touched upon the contradiction between moneyed and landed interest, which had meanwhile so sharply developed." This sentence contains as many falsehoods as words. Firstly, unlike West, Malthus, and Ricardo, Anderson did not put forward his opinion as a doctrine. Secondly, it remained not almost, but entirely unnoticed. Thirdly, it first came in incidentally in a work whose sole purpose it was to deal with the contradiction between manufacturers and landlords, a contradiction which was considerably developed in 1777, and the work only touched upon this practical battle of interests and left untouched the general theory of political economy. Fourthly, in 1815, one of the reproducers of this theory, that is Malthus, expounded it just as much in support of the Corn Laws as Anderson had done. The same doctrine was used in support of landed property by its discoverer and by Malthus, but was turned against landed property by Ricardo. Thus, at most, one might say that some of those who put it forward were defending the interests of landed property, while others who put it forward fought those same interests. But one could not say that this theory was attacked by the defenders of landed property in 1815, for Malthus defended it before Ricardo, or that it was defended by the attackers of landed property, for Ricardo did not have to defend this theory against Malthus, since he himself regarded Malthus as one of its discoverers, and as his own forerunner. He only had to combat the practical conclusions that were drawn by Malthus. Fifthly, the contradiction between moneyed and landed interest, touched upon by Roscher, had, up to that moment, absolutely nothing to do either with Anderson's theory of rent or with its reproduction. As Roscher could have gathered from John Stuart Mill, by moneyed class, the Englishman understands firstly the money lenders, and secondly, these money lenders are people who live either altogether on interest or are money lenders by profession, such as bankers, bill brokers, etc. Mill also observes that all these people who form the moneyed class are opposed to, or at any rate are distinct from, the producing class, by which Mill understands industrial capitalists, besides the working men. Hence, Roscher should see that the interests of the producing class, including the manufacturers, the industrial capitalists, and the interests of the moneyed class are two very different matters, and that these classes are different classes. Furthermore, Roscher should see that a battle between the industrial capitalists and the landlords was thus by no means a battle between the moneyed interest and the landed interest. If Roscher knew the history of the Corn Laws of 1815 and the struggle over these, then he would already have known from Cobbett that the borough mongers, that is the landed interest, and the loan mongers, that is the moneyed interest, combined against the industrial interest. But Cobbett is crude. Furthermore, Roscher should know from the history of 1815 to 1847 that in the battle over the Corn Laws, the majority of the moneyed interest, and some even of the commercial interest, Liverpool for instance, were to be found amongst the allies of the landed interest against the manufacturing interest. At most, Roscher might have been surprised that the same doctrine served in favor of landed interest in 1777 and against it in 1815, and that it caused a stir only then. If I were to elucidate in equal detail all similar gross falsifications of history which Wilhelm Thucydides Roscher commits in his literary historical notes, then I would have to write as fat a volume as his Grundlagen, and indeed such a work would not be worth the paper it was written upon. But the harmful effects which such learned ignorance as that of a Wilhelm Thucydides can have on researchers in other fields of knowledge can be seen in the example of Herr Adolf Bastian. In his work, Der Mensch in der Geschichte, published in 1860, note he quotes the above sentence of Roscher as documentary proof for a psychological assertion. Incidentally, one cannot say of Bastian that the workmanship surpasses the material. Rather, in this case, the work does not master its own raw material. Besides, I have found out through the few sciences which I know that Herr Bastian, who knows all sciences, very often relies on such authorities as Wilhelm Thucydides, which is in any case unavoidable in a pantologist. I hope I shall not be accused of unkindness towards Roscher. Note the unkindness with which this pedant himself treats science. Anyhow, I have the same right to speak of his total untruths as he has to speak in his self-satisfied and condescending manner of Ricardo's half-truths. Furthermore, Wilhelm Thucydides is by no means honest in his research and cataloging. Anyone who is not respectable does not exist for him historically either. For instance, Rodbertus does not exist for him as a theoretician of rent, because he is a communist. Besides, Roscher is also inaccurate when it comes to respectable writers. For instance, Bailey exists for McCulloch, who even regards his work as epoch-making. For Wilhelm Thucydides Roscher, he does not exist. If the science of political economy is to be furthered and popularized in Germany, people like Rodbertus should found a journal which would be open to all scholars, not pedants, prigs, and vulgarizers, and whose main purpose it would be to demonstrate the ignorance of the specialists in the science itself, as well as in its history. Anderson was in no way concerned with any inquiry into the relationship of his theory of rent to the system of political economy. This is not in the least surprising, since his first book appeared 1 year after Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, i.e., at a moment when the system of political economy was only first being consolidated, for Stuart's system too had only appeared a few years before. But so far as the material is concerned, which Anderson examined within the confines of the specific subject he was considering, this was decidedly more extensive than Ricardo's. Just as in his theory of money, the reproduction of Hume's theory, Ricardo specifically only took into account the events from 1797 to 1809, so in the theory of rent, the reproduction of Anderson's theory, he considered only the economic phenomena relating to the rise in corn prices between 1800 and 1815. The following paragraphs are very important because they clearly reflect Ricardo's character. Quote, I shall greatly regret that considerations for any particular class are allowed to check the progress of the wealth and population of the country. He says that with free import of corn, land is abandoned. In other words, landed property is sacrificed to the development of production. In connection with the free import of corn, he writes, however, that some capital would be lost cannot be disputed, but is the possession or preservation of capital the end or the means? The means, undoubtedly. What we want is an abundance of commodities, wealth in general. And if it could be proved that by the sacrifice of a part of our capital, we should augment the annual produce of those objects which contribute to our enjoyment and happiness, we ought not to repine at the loss of a part of our capital. Ricardo now terms as our capital that capital which belongs neither to us nor to him, but which has been permanently invested in the land by the capitalists. But we signifies a cross-section of the nation. The increase in our wealth is the increase in social wealth, which is an end as such, irrespective of who are the participants in this wealth. To an individual with a capital of £20,000, whose profits were £2,000 per annum, it would be a matter quite indifferent whether his capital would employ 100 or 1,000 men, whether the commodity produced sold for £10,000 or for £20,000, provided, in all cases, his profits were not diminished below £2,000. Is not the real interest of the nation similar? Provided its net real income, its rent and profits, be the same, it is of no importance whether the nation consists of 10 or 12 millions of inhabitants. Here, the proletariat is sacrificed to wealth. Insofar as it is irrelevant to the existence of wealth, its existence is a matter of indifference to wealth. Here, mass, as in mass of human beings, is worth nothing. These three instances exemplify Ricardo's scientific impartiality. The element in which the capital employed in agriculture is invested is the soil, that is nature. Hence, rent is here equal to the excess of the value of the product of labor created in this element over its average price. If, on the other hand, an element of nature or material which is privately owned by an individual is employed in another sphere of production whose physical basis it does not form, then the rent, if it only comes into being through the enjoyment of this element, cannot consist in the excess of the value of this product over the average price, but only in the excess of the general average price of this product over its own average price. For instance, a waterfall may replace the steam engine for a manufacturer and save him consumption of coal. While in possession of this waterfall, he would, for instance, constantly be selling yarn above its average price and making an excess profit. If the waterfall belongs to a landowner, this excess profit accrues to him as rent. Mr. Hopkins, in his book on rent, observes that in Lancashire, the waterfalls not only yield rent, but according to the degree of the natural motive power, they yield differential rent. Here, rent is purely the excess of the average market price of the product over its individual average price. In competition, there are two distinct movements towards equalization. Capitals within the same sphere of production equalize the prices of the commodities produced within this sphere to the same market price, irrespective of the relationship of the value of these commodities to this price. The average market price should equal the value of the commodity, were it not for the equalization between different spheres of production. As between these different spheres, competition equalizes the values to the average prices, insofar as the reciprocal interaction of the capitals is not hampered or disrupted by a third element, land ownership, etc. Section 4. Rodbertus's error regarding the relation between value and surplus value when the costs of production rise. Rodbertus is altogether mistaken when he thinks that because one commodity is dearer than another, thus realizing more labor time, it must, therefore, given the same rate of surplus value or the equal exploitation of the workers in the different spheres, also contain more unpaid labor time, surplus labor time. If the same labor yields 1/4 on unfertile land and 3 on fertile, in a good or bad year alike, if the same labor yields 1 ounce of gold in land very rich in gold, whereas in less rich or exhausted land it only yields 1/3 of an ounce, if the same labor time which produces 1 pound of wool spins 3 pounds of wool, then to begin with, the values of the 1/4 and the 3/4, of the 1 ounce of gold and the 1/3 ounce, of the 1 pound of wool and the 3 pounds of woolen yarn, minus the value of the wool it contains, are of equal magnitude. They contain equal quantities of labor time, therefore, according to the assumption, equal quantities of surplus labor time. True, the quantity of surplus labor embodied in the 1/4 grown on unfertile land is greater, but then it is only 1/4, whereas in the other case it is 3/4, or 1 pound of wool, whereas in the other case it is 3 pounds of woolen yarn. The volume of surplus labor is therefore the same, and the proportional quantity of surplus value, comparing the individual commodities with one another, is also equal. According to the assumption, the amount of labor contained in the 1/4, or the 1 pound of wool, is the same as that contained in the 3/4, or the 3 pounds of yarn. The capital laid out in wages is therefore greater to exactly the same degree as the surplus value. The 1 pound of wool contains 3 times as much labor as the 1 pound of yarn. Though the surplus value is 3 times as great, the capital laid out in wages, on which it is based, is also 3 times as great. The proportion thus remains the same. Rodbertus calculates quite wrongly here, or wrongly compares the capital laid out in wages with the greater or lesser quantity of commodities which these wages represent. But this calculation is completely wrong if, as he presupposes, wages or the rate of surplus value are given. The same quantity of labor, say 12 hours, may result in X or 3X commodities. In one case, 1X commodities contain as much labor and surplus labor as 3X in the other, but in no case would more than 1 working day be spent, and in no case would the rate of surplus value be more than, say, 1/5. In the first instance, 1/5 of the 1x would be to the x, as in the second, 1/5 of the 3x would be to the 3x. And if we were to call each of the 3x's, x prime, and x prime prime prime, then there would be 4/5 paid and 1/5 unpaid labor in each x prime, etc. It is quite right, on the other hand, that if just as much commodity were to be produced under the unproductive conditions as under more productive, the commodity would contain more labor, and so also more surplus labor. But then proportionately, a greater capital would also have to be laid out. In order to produce 3x, 3 times as much capital would have to be laid out in wages as is required to produce 1x. Now it is true that manufacture cannot work up more raw material than agriculture supplies. Thus, for instance, it cannot spin more pounds of wool than have been produced. If the productivity in wool spinning is tripled, then provided the conditions of the production of wool remain the same, 3 times as much time as previously would now have to be spent. 3 times as much capital would have to be expended on labor in wool production, whereas only the same amount of the spinner's labor time would be required to spin up his tripled quantity of wool. But the rate of surplus value would remain the same. The same spinning labor would have the same value as before and contain the same surplus value. The wool-producing labor would have a tripled surplus value, but the labor embodied in it, or the capital advanced in wages, would accordingly have tripled as well. The 3 times greater surplus value would thus be calculated on a 3 times greater capital. But this is no reason for saying that the rate of surplus value is lower in spinning than in wool production. One would only say that the capital laid out in wages is 3 times as great in one as in the other, since it is assumed here that the changes in the spinning and in the production of wool are not due to any change in their constant capital. It is necessary to make a distinction here. The same labor plus constant capital gives a smaller output in an unfavorable than a favorable season, in unproductive than in productive soil, in a poorer than in a richer mine. In the former case, the product is thus dearer, contains more labor and more surplus labor in the same number of products. But in the latter case, the number of these products is the greater. Furthermore, the ratio between paid and unpaid labor in each individual product in the 2 categories is not affected by this, for though the individual product contains less unpaid labor, according to the assumption, it also contains less paid labor in the same proportion. For it has been assumed here that there is no change in the proportions of the organic component parts of the capital, of variable and constant capital. It is assumed that the same amount of variable and constant capital supplies varying, greater or smaller, quantities of product under varying conditions. Rodbertus appears to confuse this all the time, and as a matter of course to conclude from the mere increase in the price of the product that it contains a greater surplus value. As to the rate, this is wrong even according to the assumption. As to the total, however, it is only right if more capital is advanced in one case than in the other. That means if as much is produced now of the dearer product as previously of the cheaper, or if the increased quantity of the cheaper product, as above with spinning, presupposes a correspondingly increased quantity of the dearer product. Section 5. Ricardo's denial of absolute rent, a result of his error in the theory of value. That rent, hence also the value of land, can rise, although the rate of rent remains the same or even decreases, that therefore the productivity of agriculture also increases, this Ricardo sometimes forgets, though he knows it. Anyhow, Anderson knows it, and Petty and Davenant already knew it. That is not the question. Ricardo abstracts from the question of absolute rent, which he denies on theoretical grounds, because he starts out from the false assumption that if the value of commodities is determined by labor time, the average prices of commodities must equal their values, which is why he comes to the wrong practical conclusion, that competition from more fertile types of land must throw the less fertile out of cultivation, even if they bore rent previously. If values of commodities and average prices of commodities were identical, then absolute rent, i.e. rent on the worst cultivated land, or on that originally cultivated, would be equally impossible. what is the average price of the commodity? The total capital, being constant plus variable, laid out in its production, plus the labor time contained in the average profit, say 10%. Supposing that a capital produced a higher value than the average price, just because it was operating in a particular element, an element of nature, say land, then the value of this commodity would be above its value, and this excess value would contradict the conception of value being equal to a certain quantity of labor time. An element of nature, something heterogeneous from social labor time, would be creating value, but this cannot be. Hence, capital invested in land pure and simple cannot bear rent. The worst land is land pure and simple. If the better land bears a rent, then this only shows that the difference between the individually necessary labor and that which is socially necessary becomes permanently established in agriculture because it has a natural basis, whereas in industry it is constantly disappearing. Absolute rent cannot be permitted to exist, but only differential rent. To admit the existence of absolute rent would be to admit that the same quantity of labor, materialized, laid out in constant capital, and bought with wages, creates varying values according to the element in which the labor is expended, or according to the material which it works up. But if one admits this diversity in value, although in each sphere of production the same amount of labor time materializes itself in the product, then one admits that value is not determined by labor time, but by something heterogeneous. These different magnitudes of value would invalidate the concept of value. They would invalidate the proposition that the substance of value is social labor time. Hence, its differences can only be quantitative, and these quantitative differences can only be equal to the differences in the amounts of social labor time applied. The maintenance of value, the determination not only of the amount of value by the varying amount of labor time, but also of the substance of value by social labor, thus requires the denial of absolute rent. The denial of absolute rent can, however, be expressed in two ways. Firstly, the worst land cannot bear rent. The rent from the better types of land can be explained as arising from the market price, which is the same for products which have been produced on more favorable types of land as for those which have been produced on less favorable. But the worst land is land pure and simple. It is not differentiated in itself. It differs from industrial capital investment only in that it is a special sphere of capital investment. If it bore rent, then this would arise from the fact that the same quantity of labor would produce different values if applied in different spheres of production. This means that the quantity of labor in itself does not determine the value, and products which contain the same amount of labor are not equal in terms of value. Secondly, one might say that the land which was cultivated originally must not bear rent. For what is the originally cultivated land? The land which is originally cultivated is neither better nor worse land. It is land pure and simple, undifferentiated land. Originally, capital investment in agriculture can only differ from investment in industry because of the spheres in which these capitals are invested. But since equal quantities of labor are represented in equal values, there is absolutely no reason why the capital invested in land should yield a rent in addition to profit, unless the same quantity of labor applied in this sphere produced a higher value, so that the excess of this value over the value yielded in manufacture would produce an excess profit, equal to rent. But this would amount to saying that the land as such creates value, thus invalidating the concept of value itself. The land which is cultivated originally, therefore, cannot originally bear a rent, if the whole theory of value is not to be discarded. Furthermore, this ties up very easily, although not necessarily, as Anderson shows, with the idea that originally people of course chose not the worst, but rather the best land for cultivation. With the advance of civilization and population, the land which originally bears no rent does so at a later stage, because people are forced to descend to worse types of land. And thus, in this descent to Avernus, to ever worse land, rent must arise on the originally cultivated, most fertile land, and then step by step on the land which follows it, while the worst land, which always represents simply land, the particular sphere of capital investment, never bears a rent. All this has a more or less logical coherence. If, on the other hand, one knows that average prices and values are not identical, that the average price of a commodity may be either equal to its value, or bigger or smaller, then the question, the problem itself, disappears, and with it also the hypotheses for its solution. The only remaining question is why, in agriculture, the value of the commodity, or at any rate its price, is above its average price, though not above its value. But this question no longer bears any relation to the fundamentals of the theory, the determination of value as such. Ricardo knows, of course, that the relative values of commodities are modified according to the varying proportion of fixed capital and capital laid out in wages, which enter into their production. But these are not opposites. Fixed capital and circulating capital are opposites, and circulating capital comprises not only wages but also raw materials and auxiliary materials. For example, the same ratio may exist between capital laid out in wages and fixed capital in the mining and fishing industries, as between that laid out in wages and in raw materials in tailoring. But Ricardo also knows that these relative values are equalized by competition. In fact, he only makes the differentiation so that the same average profit should result from these different capital investments. In other words, these relative values of which he speaks are only the average prices. It does not even occur to him that value and average price are different. He only gets as far as their identity. Since, however, this identity does not exist when the ratio of the organic component parts of capital varies, he accepts it as an unexplained fact brought about by competition. Hence, too, he does not come up against the question, why do the values of agricultural products not equalize in average prices? On the contrary, he assumes that they do so, and poses the problem from that point of view. It is quite incomprehensible why people a la Wilhelm Rascher should be so ardently for Ricardo's theory of rent. From their point of view, Ricardo's half-truths, as Thucydides condescendingly calls them, lose their whole value. For Ricardo, the problem only exists because value is determined by labor time. With those people, this is not the case. According to Rascher, nature as such has value. See later. In other words, he has absolutely no idea what value is. What prevents him, therefore, from allowing the value of land to enter into production costs from the outset and to form the rent? What prevents him from presupposing the value of land, i.e. rent, as an explanation for rent? With these people, the phrase production costs is meaningless. We see this with say. The value of the commodity is determined by the costs of production, capital, land, labor, but these are determined by demand and supply. In other words, no determination is taking place. Since the land performs productive services, why should not the price of these services be determined by demand and supply, just as these services performed by labor or capital? And since the land services are in the possession of certain sellers, why should their article not have a market price? In other words, why should not rent exist as an element of price? One can see how lame a reason Wilhelm Thucydides had for getting so well-meaningly vexed over the Ricardian theory. Section 6. Ricardo's thesis on the constant rise in corn prices. Table of annual average prices of corn from 1641 to 1859. But apart from absolute rent, the following question remains for Ricardo. The population grows, and with it the demand for agricultural products. Therewith, their price rises, as happens in similar cases in industry. But in industry, this rise in price ceases as soon as demand has become effective and brought about an increased supply of commodities. The product now falls to the old, or rather below the old, level of value. But in agriculture, this additional product is thrown onto the market neither at the same price nor at a lower price. It costs more and effects a constant rise in market prices, and along with that, a raising of rent. How is this to be explained if not by the fact that ever less fertile types of land are being used, that ever more labor is required in order to produce the same product, that agriculture becomes progressively more sterile? Why, apart from the influence of the depreciation of money, did agricultural products rise in England from 1797 to 1815, with the rapid development of the population? That they fell again later proves nothing. That supplies from foreign markets were cut off proves nothing. On the contrary, this in fact created the right conditions for demonstrating the effect of the law of rent as such. For it was the very cutting off of foreign supplies which forced the country to have recourse to ever less fertile land. This cannot be explained by an absolute increase in rent, because not only did the rental rise, but also the rate of rent. The quarter of wheat, etc., rose in price. It cannot be explained by depreciation, because although this might well explain why, with greater productivity in industry, industrial products fell, hence why the relative price of agricultural products rose, it would not explain why, in addition to this relative rise, the prices of agricultural products were continuously rising absolutely. Similarly, it cannot be explained as a consequence of the fall in the rate of profit. This would never explain a change in prices, but only a change in the distribution of value, or distribution of price between landlord, manufacturer, and worker. So far as depreciation is concerned, assume that 1 pound now equals 2 pounds. A quarter of wheat, which was previously equal to 2 pounds, is now equal to 4 pounds. If the industrial product fell to 1/10, and previously its value was 20 shillings, then it would now be 2 shillings. but these 2 shillings are now equal to 4 shillings. But quite apart from all this, it can be assumed that considering the state of agriculture at that time, unfertile land for wheat was being cultivated. The same land was later fertile, in that the rate of differential rents decreased, as is proved by the best barometer, namely wheat prices. The highest prices occur in the years 1800, 1801, 1811, and 1812. The first were years of poor growth, the second years of the peak of depreciation. Similarly, 1817 and 18 were years of depreciation, but if these years are omitted, probably what was left would give the average price. In comparing wheat prices, etc. in different periods, it is at the same time important to compare the amounts produced at so much per quarter, because this shows to what extent the additional production of corn influences the price. The following tables will not be read aloud for the recording. Please consult Section 6 of Chapter 9 of a physical or digital copy of the book for visual reference. Section 7. Hopkins' conjecture about the difference between absolute rent and differential rent. Explanation of rent by the private ownership of land. Hopkins grasps correctly the difference between absolute and differential rent. Quote, "The principle of competition, which renders it impossible that there should be 2 rates of profit in the same country, does determine their relative rents, but not the general average of rent." Hopkins makes the following distinction between productive and unproductive labor, or, as he says, between primary and secondary. If all laborers were employed for the same end, or object, as the diamond cutter and the opera singer, in a short time there would be no wealth to subsist them, because none of the wealth produced would then become capital. If a considerable proportion were so employed, wages would be low, because but a comparatively small part of what was produced would be used as capital. But if only a few of the laborers were so employed, and of course nearly all were plowmen, shoemakers, weavers, etc., then much capital would be produced and wages would be proportionally high. With the diamond cutter and the singer must be classed all those who labor for the landlords and who receive a part of their income as wages, all in fact whose labors terminate merely in producing those things which gratify landlords, and who receive in return for their labors a part of the rent of the landlord. These are all productive workers, but all their labors are for the purpose of converting wealth which exists in the shape of rents and annuities into some other form that shall in the other form more gratify the landlord, and therefore they are secondary producers. All other laborers are primary producers. Diamonds and song are both congealed labor, and can, like all commodities, be converted into money, and as money into capital. But in this transformation of money into capital, we must distinguish 2 things. All commodities can be converted into money, and as money into capital, because in the form of money, their use value and their particular natural form become extinct. They are materialized labor in that social form in which it is exchangeable for any real labor, therefore convertible into any form of real labor. On the other hand, whether the commodities which are the product of labor can as such become elements of productive capital once again depends on whether the nature of their use values permits them to re-enter the process of production, be it as objective conditions of labor, tools and material, or as subjective conditions, the means of subsistence of the worker, in other words, as elements of constant or variable capital. In Ireland, according to a moderate estimate and the census of 1821, the whole net produce which goes to the landlords, the government, and the tithe owners amounts to £20.75 million. The whole wages, however, only to 14.1 million. Quote, "The cultivators in Italy, generally paying from 1/2 to more than 1/2 of the produce as rent to the landlord, with moderate skill in agriculture and a scanty supply of fixed capital. The greater part of the population is composed of secondary producers and proprietors, and generally the primary producers are a poor and degraded class. The same was the case in France under Louis XIV. According to Young, rent, tithes, and taxes amounted to £140.9 million. Cultivation, moreover, was very poor. The population of France at this time is stated to have been 26.4 million. Now, if there had been 6 millions of laboring families, which is too high a figure, each family would have had to furnish annually, either directly or indirectly, an average of upwards of £23 of net wealth to the landlords. According to Young, and taking into account various other factors, the laboring family produced annually £42, 10 shillings, 23 of which were paid away to others, and £19 and 10 shillings remained to subsist itself. The dependence of the population on capital. Quote, The error of Mr. Malthus and his followers is to be found in the assumption that a reduction of the laboring population would not be followed by a correspondent reduction of capital. Mr. Malthus forgets that this demand for workers is limited by the means of paying wages, and that these means do not arise spontaneously, but are always previously created by labor. This conception of the accumulation of capital is correct, but the means can grow, i.e. the quantity of surplus produce or surplus labor can grow, without a proportionate growth in the quantity of labor. Quote, "It is somewhat extraordinary that there is a strong inclination to represent net wealth as beneficial to the working class, because it gives employment, though it is evidently not on account of being net that it has that power, but because it is wealth, wealth which has been brought into existence by labor, while at the same time an additional quantity of labor is represented as injurious to the working classes, though that labor produces 3 times as much as it consumes. If by use of superior machines, the whole primary produce could be raised from 200 to 250 or 300, while net wealth and profit took only 140, it is clear that there would remain as a fund for the wages of the primary producers 110 or 160 instead of 60. The conditions of workers is rendered bad either by crippling their productive power or by taking from them what they have produced. No, says Mr. Malthus, the weight of your burden has nothing whatever to do with your distress. That arises solely from there being too many persons carrying it. In the general principle, then, that cost of production regulates the exchangeable value of all commodities, original materials are not included, but the claim which the owners of these have upon produce causes rent to enter into value. Rent, or a charge for use, arises naturally out of ownership, or the establishment of a right of property. Anything may yield a rent if possessed of the following qualities. First, it must exist in a degree of scarcity. Secondly, it must have the power to aid labor in the great work of production. Of course, one must not take the case where land is so plentiful compared with the labor and stock to be employed upon it that no charge for rent could be made because it was not scarce. The landowner may obtain, in some countries 50%, in others 10%. In some of the fertile regions of the East, man can subsist upon 1/3 of the produce of his labor employed upon the land, but in parts of Switzerland and Norway, an exaction of 10% might depopulate the country. We see no natural bounds to the rent that may be exacted, but in the limited abilities of the payers. And where inferior soils exist, the competition of those inferior soils against the superior. There is much common land in England, the natural fertility of which is equal to what a large part of the land now cultivated was prior to its being taken into cultivation, and yet the expense of bringing such common lands into cultivation is so great as to cause them not to yield the ordinary interest for the money expended in improving them, leaving nothing as rent for the natural fertility of the soil, and this with all the advantages of an immediate application of labor, aided by stock skillfully applied, and furnished with manufactures cheaply produced, added to the very important circumstance of good roads being already formed in the neighborhood. The present landed proprietors may be considered the owners of all the accumulated labor which has for ages been expending in bringing the country to its present productive state. This is a very important circumstance in relation to rent, especially when the population suddenly grows significantly, as it did from 1780 to 1815, consequent upon the advance in industry, and hence a large portion of hitherto uncultivated land is suddenly brought into cultivation. The newly cultivated land may be as fertile as or even more fertile than the old land was, before centuries of cultivation had accumulated in it. But what is demanded of the new land, if this product is not to be sold at a dearer price, is that its fertility must be equal firstly to the natural fertility of the cultivated land, and secondly to the artificial fertility which has been engendered by cultivation, but which has now become its natural fertility. The newly cultivated land would thus have to be much more fertile than the old had been before its cultivation. But it will be said, the fertility of the cultivated land originates in the first place from its natural fertility. Thus it depends on the natural condition of the newly cultivated land, whether or not it possesses this fertility arising from and owing to nature. In either case, it costs nothing. The other part of the fertility of cultivated land is an artificial product, owing to cultivation, the investment of
Alrighty then, on to Eurovision. Thank you for listening. This has been Chapter 9 in Theories of Surplus Value. You can finish it on your own. The resources are available. Chapter 10 has been included as well. Thank you very much for your interest in this, and we'll do more of this next Saturday. This is theautonomouscollective.net, and this has been Weekly Marx, normally at 2 p.m., Saturday and Sunday. This and that information um, exists at 4 p.m., Monday through Friday. Thank you very much. Stop share.